Billionaire CEO was sitting alone at the wedding, until a stranger whispered, "Pretend you're with me." Patrick Blake controlled billion-dollar empires, but couldn't control the guilt eating him alive. 5 years ago, his last words to his sister were cold and dismissive, minutes before her fatal car accident. Now, sitting alone at a wedding surrounded by joy he'd forgotten how to feel, the untouchable CEO was drowning in his own success. Then a mysterious woman slipped into the chair beside him, whispering, "Pretend you're with me." In that moment, Patrick didn't know he was about to meet the one person who could either heal his broken soul or expose the devastating secret that would change everything. Before I dive deep into this story, make sure you subscribe now to this channel for more wonderful stories like this. Your support is what keeps stories like this alive. The Venetian chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the grand ballroom at the plaza, their crystal tears catching the golden light like frozen moments of joy. The air thrummed with celebration, the rustle of silk gowns, the gentle clink of champagne flutes, and laughter that seemed to bounce off the ornate walls and settle everywhere except where Patrick Blake sat. He occupied table 12, strategically positioned in the periphery where shadows gathered like old friends. His Armani tuxedo was flawless, his posture impeccable, his expression carefully neutral, the same mask he'd worn to board meetings, charity galas, and congressional hearings. To anyone watching, he appeared to be exactly what the world expected. Patrick Blake, the untouchable billionaire CEO whose empire spanned 3 continents. But beneath the perfectly knotted bow tie, his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. The wedding program lay untouched beside his champagne flute, the elegant script announcing the union of Margaret Whitmore and James Richardson. He'd known Margaret since college, back when life held different promises and his sister Clara would tease him about his serious demeanor. "You'll miss all the good parts if you keep frowning at spreadsheets," she used to say, her laugh bright enough to cut through any darkness. Now Clara's empty chair seemed to mock him from every corner of the room. Patrick's fingers traced the rim of his untouched champagne glass, the crystal singing a soft, mournful note. Around him, the celebration pulsed with life. Children in miniature formal wear chased each other between tables while their parents called gentle warnings. Elderly couples swayed to the string quartet's rendition of "The Way You Look Tonight," their movements speaking of decades spent learning each other's rhythms. Young lovers leaned close over flickering candles, whispering promises that Patrick once believed in. 5 years. 5 years since he'd attended a wedding. 5 years since he'd felt anything resembling joy at someone else's happiness. 5 years since that rain-soaked October night when his world shattered on a stretch of highway 20 minutes from his Manhattan office. The memory hit him like it always did, sudden and merciless. Clara's voice on his office phone, tight with hurt. "Patrick, we need to talk about the foundation. About what you said in the board meeting." His response, clipped and dismissive. "Not tonight, Clara. I have the Morrison deal to close. We'll discuss your concerns when I have time for distractions." Distractions. He'd called his sister's passion project, a foundation to help underprivileged children access arts education, a distraction. The last word he'd ever spoken to her. 23 minutes later, Clara's BMW had hydroplaned on the rain-slick FDR Drive. The police said she'd been crying when she lost control. The guilt had been eating him alive ever since, one successful deal at a time. Patrick forced himself to focus on the present, on the swirl of celebration around him. Margaret looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace, her smile bright enough to power the city. James couldn't stop staring at her like she'd hung the moon personally. Their joy was so pure, so untainted by the cynicism that had become Patrick's constant companion, that it almost hurt to witness. What would Clara think of me now? The thought whispered through his mind unbidden. She'd probably march over here and drag him onto the dance floor, consequences be damned. She'd never let him sit alone in the shadows, nursing old wounds like vintage wine. The string quartet transitioned into something softer, more intimate, and couples began gravitating toward the dance floor. Patrick watched them with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. Love, joy, connection. Concepts that felt as distant as the stars glittering beyond the ballroom's tall windows. His phone buzzed against his chest. Another email, probably from his assistant about the Tokyo merger or the quarterly projections. The business never stopped, never paused for grief or regret or the simple human need to feel something other than the weight of success. He'd built his empire into a fortress, but somewhere along the way, he'd locked himself inside it. A burst of laughter from the head table drew his attention. Margaret's maid of honor was telling some story that had the entire wedding party in stitches, their faces glowing with the kind of unguarded happiness Patrick couldn't remember experiencing. Even the flower girl, no more than 6 years old, was giggling behind her tiny bouquet. When did I become the kind of man who sits alone at weddings? The question settled in his chest like a stone. He knew the answer, of course. It had started the night Clara died, when guilt became his most faithful companion. Every subsequent choice had been about control, about ensuring he never again had to feel the helpless rage of losing someone who mattered. Better to keep the world at arm's length than risk another devastating loss. But sitting here, surrounded by celebration and connection, Patrick felt the true cost of his isolation. He'd become a ghost haunting his own life, successful beyond measure but starving for something money couldn't buy. The champagne in his glass had gone flat, tiny bubbles clinging to the sides like his last hopes for redemption. He should leave, make his excuses, send an expensive gift, and retreat to his penthouse where the silence was familiar and the solitude was chosen rather than imposed. He was reaching for his phone to call his driver when it happened. A voice, soft but urgent, cut through the ambient noise of celebration like a whisper in a cathedral. "Pretend you're with me." Patrick's hand froze halfway to his jacket pocket. He turned, expecting to find someone speaking to a companion, but instead found himself looking into the most extraordinary pair of eyes he'd ever seen. They were the color of storm clouds, gray-green and full of secrets, belonging to a woman who had somehow appeared in the chair beside him without his notice. She was beautiful, but not in the polished, artificial way of the socialites who usually populated these events. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and her dress, a simple navy blue that probably cost less than his tie, somehow made her stand out more than all the designer gowns in the room. But it was her expression that caught him off guard, knowing, compassionate, and utterly unafraid. "I'm sorry," Patrick managed, his voice rougher than intended. She tilted her head slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "There's a table of women over there who've been staring at you for the past 10 minutes, whispering about the tragic, lonely billionaire. I thought you might prefer some company to their pity." Patrick followed her gaze to table 7, where indeed, for women in their 50s were watching him with the kind of predatory sympathy that made his skin crawl. The moment they realized they'd been caught, they quickly turned back to their conversation, but the damage was done. "Ah," he said, understanding flooding through him. "And you're volunteering to be my, what? Beard. Decoy. Friend," she said simply. "For the next hour or so, anyway. Unless you prefer sitting alone while they plan your romantic intervention." There was something in her voice, a warmth that seemed genuine rather than calculated, that made Patrick pause. In his world, every interaction came with an agenda, every kindness had a price. But this woman, this stranger, was offering him something he hadn't experienced in years: uncomplicated human connection. What do you think drives someone to reach out to a stranger in their moment of need? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. Before he could second-guess himself, Patrick found himself saying, "I'm Patrick." "Zita," she replied, settling more comfortably in her chair. "And before you ask, yes, I know who you are. No, I don't want anything from you. And no, I'm not impressed by your net worth." Despite himself, Patrick felt his lips twitch upward, the ghost of a smile he'd thought long dead. "Well, that's refreshingly honest." "I find honesty saves time," Zita said, reaching for the untouched champagne flute at the place setting beside his. "Mind if I?" "Please." Patrick watched as she took a small sip, her eyes never leaving his face. "So, Zita, what brings you to Margaret and James's wedding, besides rescuing antisocial billionaires from well-meaning matchmakers?" "I'm Margaret's cousin," she said. "The black sheep of the family, according to my aunt. I teach high school art in Brooklyn, drive a car that's older than some of my students, and have the audacity to be 32 and unmarried." "Scandalous," Patrick said, and was surprised to find he meant it as a joke rather than sarcasm. Isn't it? Zita's smile widened. What about you? Besides the obvious, she gestured vaguely at his expensive attire and the aura of wealth that surrounded him like cologne. What brings Patrick Blake to a wedding where he clearly doesn't want to be? The question hit closer to home than she could know. Patrick found himself studying her face, looking for signs of the calculated interest he'd grown accustomed to. But Zita's expression remained open, curious without being invasive, patient without being pushy. Obligation, he said finally. Margaret and I went to Colombia together. She was friends with my sister. Something shifted in Zita's expression, a flicker of understanding that suggested she'd caught the past tense and its implications. But she didn't pry, didn't offer empty condolences or ask probing questions. Instead, she simply nodded. Obligation can be a heavy burden, she said quietly, especially when it's mixed with grief. The words hung between them, simple and true and more perceptive than Patrick had expected. He found himself really looking at her for the first time, taking in the intelligence in her storm-colored eyes, the way she held herself with quiet confidence despite being surrounded by wealth and privilege that clearly wasn't her world. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect? Someone who wanted something from me." Zita laughed, a sound like silver bells that made something tight in Patrick's chest loosen slightly. "Oh, I do want something from you." Patrick tensed, the familiar walls beginning to rise. "And what's that?" "I want you to stop looking like you're attending your own funeral," she said, her tone light but her eyes serious. "Just for tonight. Just while we're pretending to be friends instead of strangers." The request was so unexpected, so refreshingly honest, that Patrick found himself speechless. Around them, the wedding continued its joyful chaos, the clink of silverware against china, the rustle of fabric as couples moved to the dance floor, the gentle hum of conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter. But in their small corner of the celebration, something had shifted. For the first time in 5 years, Patrick Blake felt the possibility of connection. It terrified him almost as much as it intrigued him. The string quartet began a new song, something soft and romantic that made the candlelight seem warmer, the shadows less oppressive. Zita turned to watch the dancers, her profile elegant in the flickering light, and Patrick found himself wondering what it would be like to see the world through her eyes, to find beauty in simple moments instead of calculating their market value. "Tell me something," Zita said, turning back to him. "When was the last time you danced at a wedding?" The question hit him like a physical blow. The last time had been at his college roommate's wedding, 7 years ago. Clara had been his date, spinning around the dance floor in a yellow dress that made her look like sunshine personified. She dragged him onto the floor for 3 songs, laughing at his protests that he didn't dance, that he had calls to make, deals to close. "It's been a while," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Zita studied his face with those perceptive eyes. "I see. Well, that's a shame. Dancing is one of life's great pleasures. Right up there with good wine, terrible movies, and the perfect slice of pizza. You have simple tastes. I have authentic tastes," she corrected. "There's a difference." Before Patrick could respond, the music swelled, and Margaret and James took the floor for their first dance as husband and wife. The room fell silent except for the gentle strains of "At Last," and Patrick watched as the couple moved together with a kind of synchronicity that spoke of deep love and deeper trust. He felt Zita's eyes on him and turned to find her watching his reaction rather than the dancers. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly. "Yes," Patrick replied, though he wasn't sure if he was talking about the dance or the woman beside him. As the song ended and other couples joined the newlyweds on the floor, Patrick felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the desire to be part of something larger than himself. The urge to step out of the shadows and into the light, even if it meant risking the pain that came with genuine connection. Zita seemed to sense his internal struggle. She stood gracefully, smoothing down her simple dress, and extended her hand to him. "Come on, Patrick Blake," she said, her voice warm with invitation and challenge. "Let's give those ladies at table 7 something real to talk about." Patrick stared at her outstretched hand, knowing that taking it would mean more than just a dance. It would mean stepping back into a world he'd abandoned, risking the kind of vulnerability that had once cost him everything. But as he looked into Zita's storm-colored eyes, he saw something that made his breath catch: the possibility of redemption. Not the kind that came from charitable donations or business success, but the kind that came from human connection, from allowing someone else to see past the walls he'd built around his heart. The choice hung before him like a bridge over an abyss. He could stay in his chair, safe in his isolation, or he could take her hand and step into the unknown. The music played on, couples swayed in the golden light, and somewhere in the distance, Patrick could almost hear Clara's voice. "Don't miss all the good parts, Patrick. Don't let fear steal what's left of your life." His hand moved toward Zita's, trembling slightly with the weight of possibility and the terror of hope. Patrick's hand closed around Zita's, and the simple contact sent an unexpected jolt through his system. Not the calculated handshakes of boardroom negotiations, but something warm and real and utterly foreign. Her skin was soft, but her grip was firm, confident, and as she led him toward the dance floor, he caught the faint scent of jasmine and something uniquely her. "I should warn you," Patrick said as they found a space among the other couples. "I'm not exactly known for my dancing skills." "Good thing I'm not known for my expectations," Zita replied, turning to face him with that enigmatic smile that seemed to hold secrets he desperately wanted to understand. As Patrick placed his hand on her waist and she rested hers on his shoulder, he was struck by how perfectly she fit against him. Not too tall, not too short, but exactly right in a way that made him wonder if the universe occasionally got things correct by accident. The string quartet was playing something slow and romantic, and around them, other couples swayed in their own private worlds. "So," Zita said as they began to move, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "tell me about the real Patrick Blake. Not the one from Forbes magazine or the Wall Street Journal. The one who sits alone at weddings looking like he's carrying the weight of the world." Patrick's first instinct was to deflect, to offer the polished sound bites he'd perfected over years of interviews and public appearances. But something in Zita's expression, patient, genuinely curious, completely free of judgment, made him pause. "The real Patrick Blake," he said slowly, "is probably not very interesting. He works too much, sleeps too little, and has forgotten how to be around people who don't want something from him. That's what he does, not who he is," Zita observed, her storm-colored eyes never leaving his face. "Try again." The directness of her challenge caught him off guard. In his world, people rarely pushed back, rarely demanded authenticity over image. They were content with the surface, with the power and wealth and carefully constructed persona he presented to the world. "I don't know who he is anymore," Patrick admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I used to think I did. I used to have clarity, purpose beyond just accumulating more zeros in my bank account." What changed? The question hung between them as they swayed to the music, and Patrick found himself at a crossroads. He could retreat into safe territory, change the subject, maintain the walls that had protected him for 5 years. Or he could do something terrifying, tell the truth. "I lost someone," he said finally. "Someone who mattered more than all the rest of it combined. And I realized that all my success, all my control, all my careful planning, none of it meant anything when it came to protecting the people I loved." Zita's expression softened, but she didn't offer empty platitudes or meaningless comfort. Instead, she simply nodded, as if she understood the particular weight of that kind of loss. "Your sister," she said quietly. "It wasn't a question." Patrick's step faltered slightly. "How did you?" "Margaret mentioned her once." "Clara, right?" She said Clara was the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. That she had this infectious laugh and a heart big enough to save the world. The description hit Patrick like a physical blow, so accurate it took his breath away. Clara had been exactly that. A force of nature wrapped in a 5'4" package, with their mother's green eyes and their father's stubborn determination channeled into making the world a better place. "She was," Patrick said, his voice rougher than he intended. "She was everything good about our family. Everything I wasn't." "I doubt that's true." "You didn't know her." "She saw the best in everyone, believed in second chances, thought love could conquer anything. She was." Patrick paused, struggling with words that felt inadequate. "She was light. Pure, uncomplicated light. And I was so focused on building my empire that I forgot to protect what actually mattered." They continued to dance, moving slowly among the other couples, but Patrick felt as though they were in their own bubble, separate from the celebration around them. Zita's hand was warm on his shoulder, grounding him in the present even as memories threatened to pull him under. "Tell me about her," Zita said softly. "What made her laugh?" The request surprised him. Most people, when they learned about Clara, either changed the subject quickly or offered awkward condolences before moving on to safer topics. But Zita seemed genuinely interested in knowing about his sister, not just acknowledging her death. "Terrible movies," Patrick said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. She had this collection of the worst romantic comedies ever made. Movies so bad they were almost good. She'd make me watch them with her when I came home from college, and she'd laugh at all the ridiculous plot twists like they were the height of comedy. Sounds like she had excellent taste in terrible entertainment. She did. She also had this way of finding the perfect gift for people. Not expensive things, she didn't care about money, but meaningful things. Things that showed she really saw you, really understood what would make you happy. Patrick's voice grew quieter. "The last Christmas before she died, she gave me a photo album. Pictures of us as kids, family vacations, moments I'd forgotten. She'd written little notes next to each picture, memories I didn't even know she'd kept." "Do you still have it?" "It's in my safe," Patrick admitted. "I haven't looked at it since the funeral. I couldn't. It hurt too much." Zita was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the same thoughtful attention she'd given everything else he'd shared. Around them, the music swelled, and Patrick caught glimpses of other couples lost in their own conversations, their own moments of connection. "What was she passionate about?" Zita asked. "Besides terrible movies and perfect gifts." "Art education for underprivileged kids," Patrick said immediately. She believed that creativity could change lives, that every child deserved access to beauty and self-expression. She was trying to start a foundation, had all these plans. His voice trailed off as the familiar guilt settled in his chest like a stone. "The foundation you called a distraction." Patrick's steps faltered completely this time, and he stared at Zita in shock. "How could you possibly know that?" "I didn't," Zita said gently. "But I recognize the look of someone carrying guilt that doesn't belong to them. And I know that the people we love most are often the ones we hurt most deeply, usually right before we lose the chance to make it right." The accuracy of her observation left Patrick speechless. He'd never told anyone about that last conversation with Clara, about the dismissive way he'd brushed off her passion project, about the cruel irony that she died while driving away from his office after he'd essentially told her that her dreams didn't matter. "She was crying," Patrick said, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. "When she lost control of the car. The police said she'd been crying." "Patrick!" Zita's voice was firm but gentle. "You didn't cause the accident. Rain and bad timing and 1,000 other factors caused the accident. Not your words, not your dismissal of her foundation, not anything you did or didn't do." "But if I hadn't?" "If you hadn't what? Been human? Made a mistake? Said something you regretted?" Zita shook her head. "Clara loved you. Margaret told me that much. She said Clara talked about you constantly, how proud she was of your success, how much she admired your drive and determination. One conversation, one moment of frustration, doesn't erase a lifetime of love." Patrick wanted to argue, to insist that Zita didn't understand the magnitude of his failure, the weight of his last words to his sister. But something in her expression stopped him, a depth of understanding that suggested she knew more about loss and regret than her calm exterior revealed. "What about you?" Patrick asked, deflecting attention from his own pain. "What drives Zita, the high school art teacher who rescues antisocial billionaires at weddings?" A shadow passed across Zita's face, so quickly that Patrick almost missed it. But he'd spent years reading people, looking for tells and weaknesses in business negotiations, and he caught the brief flicker of something. Pain, perhaps, or loss of her own. "I believe in second chances," she said simply. "In the power of art to heal, in the possibility that people can change, that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be." That sounds like it comes from experience. "Doesn't everything?" Zita's smile was enigmatic, revealing nothing while somehow conveying everything. I teach teenagers, Patrick. Every day I see kids who've been written off by the world, told they're not smart enough or talented enough or worthy enough. And then I watch them create something beautiful, something uniquely theirs, and I see them realize that they matter. That their voice, their perspective, their art has value. Like Clara's foundation would have done. Exactly like that. Zita's eyes brightened with genuine enthusiasm. Art isn't just about creating pretty pictures. It's about giving people a way to express what they can't say with words, to process trauma and joy and everything in between. It's about showing them that their inner world has value, that their creativity matters. Patrick found himself studying her face as she spoke, noting the way her entire demeanor changed when she talked about her work. The careful composure gave way to genuine passion, and he caught a glimpse of the woman beneath the surface. Someone who cared deeply, who fought for the underdog, who believed in transformation even when the odds were stacked against it. "How long have you been teaching?" he asked. 8 years. I started right after. Zita paused, that shadow crossing her face again. Right after I realized that some dreams are worth more than others. That making a difference in one kid's life is worth more than any amount of personal success. There was a story there, Patrick realized. Something that had changed Zita's trajectory, shifted her priorities in a way that resonated with his own experience of loss and redirection. But before he could probe deeper, the music changed to something more upbeat, and other couples began to shift and separate around them. "Should we sit this one out?" Patrick asked, though he found himself reluctant to break the connection they'd established. "Actually," Zita said, glancing toward the bar, "I could use some air, and maybe some real conversation away from the crowd. Would you like to step outside for a few minutes?" Patrick nodded, following her lead as they made their way off the dance floor and toward the ballroom's French doors that opened onto a terrace overlooking Central Park. The October air was crisp but not cold, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sounds of the city. The terrace was mostly empty except for a few other couples seeking privacy or fresh air. Zita moved to the stone railing, looking out over the park where the trees were just beginning to turn, their leaves catching the light from the ballroom behind them. "Better?" she asked, turning to face him. "Much." Patrick joined her at the railing, noting how the moonlight caught the highlights in her dark hair, how the cool air had brought a flush to her cheeks. "Thank you. For the dance, for the conversation, for this. Whatever this is. This is two people being honest with each other," Zita said. "It's rarer than it should be, but not as complicated as we make it. What do you think is more powerful, the connections we plan or the ones that surprise us? Let us know in the comments below." Patrick was quiet for a moment, processing the events of the evening. An hour ago, he'd been sitting alone, drowning in guilt and isolation. Now he was standing on a moonlit terrace with a woman who seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed defenses to the man he'd forgotten he could be. "Can I ask you something?" Patrick said. "Of course. Why did you really come over to my table? And don't say it was just to save me from the matchmaking committee at table 7. Zita was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the stone railing. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, more vulnerable. "Because I recognized the look," she said. "The way you were sitting there, surrounded by celebration but completely alone. I've worn that expression myself. I know what it feels like to be drowning in a room full of people who think they know who you are but have no idea what you're carrying." "And what are you carrying, Zita?" She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight, Patrick could see the careful walls she'd built around her own pain. They were different from his, more subtle, more artfully constructed, but they were there nonetheless. "The weight of choices that can't be undone," she said simply. "The knowledge that sometimes the people we love most pay the price for our ambitions. The understanding that success means nothing if it comes at the cost of your soul." The words hung between them, heavy with implication and shared understanding. Patrick realized that Zita wasn't just a kind stranger who'd taken pity on him. She was someone who understood loss and regret from the inside, someone who'd walked through her own fire and emerged changed. "What happened?" he asked gently. Zita was quiet for so long that Patrick thought she might not answer. But finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was engaged once. To a man who loved me more than I deserved, who supported my dreams even when they took me away from him. I was so focused on my career, on making it as an artist in the city, that I forgot to nurture what we had. I kept promising that things would be different after the next gallery showing, the next commission, the next opportunity. But there was always another next thing." She paused, her hands gripping the railing tightly. "He died in a car accident 3 days before our wedding. He was coming back from picking up his tuxedo, excited about our future, probably planning some surprise for the honeymoon. And I was in my studio, working on a piece that I thought was more important than spending time with the man I was supposed to marry." Patrick felt his breath catch. The parallel to his own story was too close, too painful to ignore. "Zita, I'm so sorry." "The worst part," she continued, as if she hadn't heard him, "was that his last voicemail was him telling me he loved me, that he couldn't wait to start our life together. He was happy, Patrick. He died happy and in love, while I was too busy chasing success to appreciate what I already had. That's why you became a teacher. That's why I learned the difference between success and significance," Zita corrected. "Between achieving your goals and living your values. David, that was his name. He would have been a wonderful father. He talked about having kids, about teaching them to ride bikes and helping with homework and all those ordinary, beautiful moments that make up a life. When he died, I realized that all my artistic ambitions meant nothing compared to the impact he would have had on the world just by being himself." Patrick understood now why Zita had approached him, why she'd seen through his isolation to the pain beneath. They were kindred spirits, both carrying the weight of last conversations that couldn't be taken back, both learning to live with the knowledge that love was more fragile than they'd ever imagined. "So you teach," Patrick said. "You give other people the chances you wish you'd given David." "I try to," Zita said. "Every day, I try to show my students that their creativity matters, that their voices deserve to be heard. It's not the same as having a family with David, but it's meaningful. It's a way of honoring what he believed in, what we could have built together." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd found unexpected understanding in the midst of a celebration. Around them, the sounds of the wedding continued, laughter and music and the gentle hum of conversation, but Patrick felt as though they existed in their own pocket of time and space. "We're quite a pair," he said finally. "The billionaire who forgot how to live and the artist who learned too late what really matters." "Maybe that's exactly what we both need," Zita said, turning to face him fully. "Someone who understands that success without connection is just expensive loneliness." Patrick looked into her storm-colored eyes and felt something shift inside him, not the desperate grab for redemption he'd expected, but something quieter and more profound. The possibility of healing, of finding a way forward that honored both his grief and his hope for something better. "Zita," he said, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept buried for too long. "I don't know how to do this. How to let someone in again. How to risk caring about someone when I know how quickly it can all disappear." "Neither do I," she admitted. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't have to know how. Maybe we just have to be willing to try." The music from the ballroom swelled, and through the French doors, Patrick could see couples dancing, families laughing, friends embracing. Life continuing in all its messy, beautiful, heartbreaking glory. For the first time in 5 years, Patrick Blake felt the stirring of something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. Not the desperate kind that grasped at anything to fill the void, but the quiet kind that whispered of possibility, of second chances, of love that could coexist with loss. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps and a voice that made Patrick's blood run cold. "Well, well. Patrick Blake, as I live and breathe." Patrick turned to see a man in his 50s approaching across the terrace, his expensive suit doing little to disguise the predatory gleam in his eyes. Richard Hawthorne, a name that had haunted Patrick's nightmares for the past 5 years, though for reasons he'd never shared with anyone. "Richard," Patrick said, his voice carefully neutral despite the way his heart had begun to race. "I didn't realize you'd be here." "Margaret's family has been clients of mine for years," Richard replied smoothly, his gaze sliding from Patrick to Zita with obvious interest. "And you must be leaving," Zita said firmly, clearly sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the air. She placed a gentle hand on Patrick's arm. "Patrick, shall we head back inside?" But Richard stepped closer, blocking their path with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Oh, don't rush off on my account. I was just thinking how interesting it is to see Patrick here, given his history with weddings." Patrick felt Zita's questioning gaze, but he couldn't look away from Richard's face. The man's smile was sharp as a blade, and Patrick knew with sinking certainty that this encounter was no coincidence. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Patrick said carefully. "Aren't you?" Richard's laugh was cold. "Come now, Patrick. We both know why you really stopped attending social events. Why you've become such a recluse. It's amazing what guilt can do to a man, isn't it?" The words hit Patrick like physical blows. Beside him, he felt Zita tense, her protective instincts clearly activated even though she didn't understand the context. "I think you've had too much to drink, Richard," Patrick said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Perhaps you should." "Oh, I'm perfectly sober," Richard interrupted. "Sober enough to remember that night 5 years ago. Sober enough to remember the phone call you made right before your sister's accident." Patrick's world tilted. The phone call. The one he'd never told anyone about. The one that had haunted him more than even his last conversation with Clara. How could Richard possibly know about that? "I don't know what you're talking about," Patrick said, but his voice betrayed him, coming out strained and hollow. "Don't you?" Richard's smile widened. "The call to Morrison Industries. The one where you threatened to pull out of the merger if they didn't fire their head of acquisitions, Clara's boyfriend, wasn't it? What was his name?" "Michael Chen." Zita's sharp intake of breath was audible, but Patrick couldn't focus on anything except the roaring in his ears. The secret he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it hadn't happened was being dragged into the light by the last person on Earth he'd expected to know about it. "You see," Richard continued, clearly enjoying Patrick's distress, "Michael was devastated when he lost that job. Devastated enough to call Clara, crying, begging her to talk to her big brother about giving him another chance. And Clara, sweet, loyal Clara, was upset enough to drive to your office in the rain to confront you about destroying her boyfriend's career." "Stop," Patrick said, his voice barely a whisper. "She was crying when she left your building, wasn't she?" Richard pressed on relentlessly. Crying because she'd just learned that her beloved brother had sabotaged the man she loved. Crying because she realized that the Patrick Blake she'd idolized was capable of petty, vindictive cruelty. The question hit him like a revelation. For 5 years, he'd been so focused on his guilt, his pain, his responsibility for Clara's death, that he'd never asked himself what she would have wanted him to do with that knowledge. Clara, who'd believed in second chances. Clara, who'd fought for the underdog. Clara, who'd dreamed of creating something beautiful for children who had nothing. "She'd want me to fight," Patrick said quietly. "She'd want me to protect those families, that community. She'd want me to stop Richard from destroying everything she cared about. Even if it meant sacrificing your reputation, your empire." Patrick thought about his sister's laugh, her infectious optimism, her unwavering belief that love and art and human connection mattered more than money or power or public opinion. "Especially then," he said. Zita smiled, and Patrick felt something shift inside him. Not the desperate grab for redemption he'd expected, but something quieter and more profound. The understanding that he had a choice, that he could honor Clara's memory not by drowning in guilt but by fighting for what she believed in. "There's something else," Zita said, her voice careful. "Something Richard said that doesn't add up." "What do you mean?" "How did he know about the phone call? About the specific details of what happened that night? You said you never told anyone about having Michael fired." Patrick frowned, thinking back to Richard's words. I don't know. Morrison's executives, maybe, but they signed confidentiality agreements. And Richard just happened to have access to 5-year-old corporate communications? Just happened to know exactly which pressure points would hurt you most. Zita shook her head. "This feels orchestrated, Patrick. Like he's been planning this confrontation for a long time." The observation sent a chill down Patrick's spine. Richard's appearance tonight, his knowledge of Patrick's deepest secrets, his perfectly timed ultimatum. It was all too convenient, too calculated. But why? Patrick asked. Why go to all this trouble for one development project? Maybe it's not about the project, Zita said. Maybe it's about you. About destroying you specifically. Before Patrick could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at the screen and felt his blood turn to ice. The message was from an unknown number, but the content was unmistakable. A photo of Clara's car after the accident, twisted metal and shattered glass, with a single line of text below it, 47 hours and counting. Patrick's hands shook as he showed the message to Zita, whose face went pale in the moonlight. He's not just blackmailing you, she said quietly. He's torturing you. This is personal, Patrick. Very personal. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of laughter drifted from the ballroom. Richard's voice, loud and jovial, as if he hadn't just delivered a devastating ultimatum to a man already drowning in guilt. Patrick looked at Zita, seeing his own determination reflected in her storm-colored eyes. Whatever Richard's true agenda, whatever game he was playing, Patrick was done being a victim of his own guilt and fear. I need to find out what Richard really wants, Patrick said. And I need to find a way to stop him without destroying those families. We need to find a way, Zita corrected. You're not doing this alone. The simple word, we, hit Patrick with unexpected force. For 5 years, he'd carried his guilt and isolation like armor, convinced that he deserved to face his demons alone. But looking at Zita, seeing the fierce determination in her expression, he realized that maybe redemption wasn't a solitary journey after all. Why? He asked. Why would you want to help me? You barely know me, and now you know the worst thing I've ever done. Zita was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving from his face to the lights of the city beyond the park. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. Because I recognize something in you that I lost in myself for a long time after David died, she said. The capacity for love, for sacrifice, for putting others before yourself. You made a terrible mistake, but you made it out of love for Clara, out of a desire to protect her. That matters, Patrick. That's the difference between a good man who made a bad choice and a bad man who doesn't care about the consequences. And which one am I? Zita turned back to him, her storm-colored eyes holding his with unwavering certainty. You're a good man who's been punishing himself for 5 years for being human. And it's time to stop punishing yourself and start fighting for what Clara would have wanted. The music from the ballroom swelled again, and Patrick could see couples dancing through the French doors, lost in their own worlds of joy and celebration. But out here on the terrace, under the October stars, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The possibility of partnership, of shared purpose, of love that could coexist with loss and grow stronger because of it. So what do we do? Patrick asked. Zita's smile was fierce and beautiful and full of promise. We fight. We find out what Richard really wants. We protect those families, and we make sure Clara's dream doesn't die with her. As they stood together on the moonlit terrace, Patrick felt the weight of 5 years of guilt beginning to shift. Not disappearing, he suspected it never would entirely, but transforming into something else. Something that could fuel action instead of paralysis, hope instead of despair, love instead of isolation. The battle for Clara's legacy was about to begin, and for the first time since her death, Patrick Blake wasn't facing it alone. The ballroom seemed too bright, too loud when they returned from the terrace. Patrick's mind raced with Richard's ultimatum, while beside him, Zita maintained a calm composure that belied the intensity of their conversation moments ago. We need somewhere private to talk, Patrick said quietly. Somewhere Richard won't be watching. Zita nodded, her eyes scanning the room with newfound wariness. I know a place. Follow me. She led him through the reception, navigating between dancing couples and laughing guests with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the venue. Patrick followed, acutely aware of Richard's gaze tracking them from across the room. The man raised his champagne glass in a mock toast, his smile cold and calculating. Zita guided Patrick down a service corridor, through a staff area, and finally to a small courtyard garden hidden from the main ballroom. Stone benches surrounded a simple fountain, and the sounds of the wedding faded to a distant murmur behind thick walls. Margaret showed me this place earlier, Zita explained. She said it was where she used to hide when her parents hosted parties and she needed to escape. Patrick glanced around, assessing the space with practiced precision. No cameras. No easy sightlines from the main building. Smart. Old buildings have their secrets, Zita said, settling onto one of the benches. Now, tell me everything you know about Richard Hawthorne and why he might have a personal vendetta against you. Patrick paced the small courtyard, his mind racing through years of business deals, rivalries, and conflicts. Richard's firm has represented some of my competitors, but we've never had direct business dealings. I've opposed some of his development projects when they violated environmental regulations, but nothing that would justify this level of hostility. This feels more personal than business, Zita observed. The way he spoke about Clara, about you, there's something deeper there. Patrick stopped pacing and pulled out his phone. I need to call my head of security. If Richard's been collecting information about Clara's accident, about that call to Morrison Industries, I need to know how deep this goes. As Patrick made the call, Zita watched him transform. The vulnerable man from their dance had receded, replaced by the CEO whose name commanded respect and fear in boardrooms across the globe. His voice was crisp, authoritative, brooking no argument as he instructed his security team to begin a comprehensive investigation into Richard Hawthorne's personal and financial history, focusing on any connections to Blake Industries, Morrison Industries, or Clara herself. When he finished the call, Patrick turned back to Zita, his expression grim. My team will have preliminary information by morning. In the meantime, I need to figure out what Richard really wants. The Meridian project is valuable, but not valuable enough to justify this level of risk. Maybe it's not about money, Zita suggested. Maybe it's about destroying what Clara cared about. Patrick's brow furrowed. What do you mean? You said Clara wanted to build an art center in that neighborhood. If Richard destroys the community, he destroys her dream. Zita leaned forward, her expression intense. What if this is about erasing Clara's legacy completely? Destroying not just her memory, but everything she hoped to build? The suggestion hit Patrick like a physical blow. Could Richard's vendetta extend beyond him to Clara herself? But why? What connection could Richard possibly have had to his sister? I need to know more about the Meridian project, Patrick said. About who stands to benefit, about what's really driving it. I can help with that, Zita said. My school is in that neighborhood. I know the community, the families who would be displaced. I've been to the town hall meetings where they've discussed the development. Patrick looked at her with newfound respect. You've been fighting this project already, haven't you? Along with half the neighborhood, Zita confirmed. But we're up against powerful interests with deep pockets. The kind of money that makes city officials look the other way when zoning laws get bent. Money I have, Patrick said, his mind already calculating moves and countermoves. If this is about Clara's legacy, I can use my resources to protect it. It's not just about money, Zita cautioned. These are people's homes, their communities, their lives. If we're going to fight for them, we need to understand what they're fighting for. Patrick was quiet for a moment, absorbing her words. For 5 years, he'd approached every problem as a business challenge. Numbers to be calculated, assets to be leveraged, risks to be mitigated. He'd forgotten what Clara had always known, that behind every statistic were real people with real lives. You're right, he admitted. I need to see this community for myself. To understand what's at stake beyond property values and development potential. Zita's expression softened. Tomorrow morning. I'll show you the neighborhood, introduce you to the people who would be affected. But tonight. She glanced at her watch. Margaret will be throwing the bouquet soon, and my absence will be noticed. We should go back, Patrick agreed. Keep up appearances while we figure out our next steps. But as they prepared to return to the reception, Patrick caught Zita's hand. Thank you, he said quietly, for not walking away when you learned the truth, for seeing something in me worth fighting alongside. Zita's fingers curled around his, warm and steady. Maybe we both needed a second chance, she said. A chance to fight for something that matters instead of drowning in regret. The simple touch, the shared understanding, felt more intimate than any embrace Patrick could remember. For a moment, they stood in the quiet courtyard, connected by more than just their hands. Connected by shared purpose, by mutual recognition of pain and possibility, by the fragile beginnings of something neither had expected to find. When they finally returned to the ballroom, Patrick felt different. Lighter, more focused, as if the weight of his guilt had been transformed into something purposeful. Richard was still there, watching them with calculated interest, but Patrick met his gaze without flinching. Whatever game Richard was playing, Patrick was no longer a passive participant. The celebration continued around them. The cake had been cut, champagne flowed freely, and couples swayed on the dance floor to the string quartet's romantic melodies. Patrick and Zita rejoined the festivities, careful to maintain the appearance of newfound friends enjoying the wedding, nothing more. But everything had changed. Every smile they shared now held deeper meaning. Every casual touch carried the weight of their secret alliance. Every glance communicated silent understanding. When Margaret prepared to throw her bouquet, Zita reluctantly joined the cluster of single women. Patrick watched from the sidelines, struck by how different she was from the others. Where they jostled and giggled with excited anticipation, Zita stood with quiet dignity, participating out of obligation rather than hope. The bouquet arced through the air, and through some cosmic joke or fate, landed directly in Zita's surprised hands. The crowd cheered, and Patrick found himself smiling at her flustered expression. For a moment, their eyes met across the room, and something electric passed between them. Possibility, promise, potential. Then Richard appeared at Patrick's side, his voice low and menacing beneath his public smile. "Charming woman, your new friend," he said. "I wonder if she'd be so taken with you if she knew the whole truth about Clara's accident." Patrick maintained his composure, though his heart raced. "What whole truth, Richard? You've made your accusations clear." "Have I?" Richard's smile was cold. "I've barely scratched the surface, Patrick. Did you know the police report mentioned a second car at the scene? One that left before emergency services arrived." Patrick's blood turned to ice. This was new information, information he'd never heard despite his exhaustive investigation into the accident. "You're lying," he said, but doubt had already taken root. "Am I?" Richard sipped his champagne casually. "Check the original police report, not the sanitized version your lawyers provided. There are photos of tire tracks, witness statements about headlights behind Clara's car. Quite mysterious, wouldn't you say?" Before Patrick could respond, Richard slipped something into his jacket pocket, a small flash drive. "A preview of what goes public if you don't cooperate," Richard murmured. 45 hours now, Patrick. Tick-tock. With that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Patrick frozen in place, the flash drive heavy in his pocket like a live grenade. Across the room, Zita's concerned eyes found his, and he gave a slight shake of his head, a warning to maintain their casual facade. The remainder of the reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical conversation. Patrick made the expected rounds, congratulated the newlyweds, and participated in the social rituals required of him while his mind raced with Richard's new revelation. A second car at the scene of Clara's accident? What did it mean, and how did Richard know about it when Patrick, with all his resources and connections, did not? When the celebration finally began to wind down, Patrick and Zita met again near the coat check, their conversation disguised as casual small talk for any watching eyes. "Richard mentioned a second car at the accident scene," Patrick murmured as he helped Zita with her wrap. "Information that wasn't in any report I saw." Zita's eyes widened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Do you believe him?" "I don't know," Patrick admitted. "But he gave me this." He touched his pocket where the flash drive sat. "Said it's a preview of what goes public if I don't cooperate." "We need to see what's on it," Zita said decisively. "Tonight." Patrick nodded, scanning the thinning crowd for any sign of Richard. "My penthouse has secure servers, encryption. We can view it there without risk of it being traced." He saw the moment of hesitation in Zita's eyes, the natural caution of a woman being invited to a man's home after knowing him only hours. But the urgency of their situation overrode conventional concerns. "I'll call my driver," Patrick said. Unless you'd prefer. No, Zita interrupted. Your place makes sense. Just let me text my roommate so she knows where I am. 20 minutes later, they were in Patrick's private elevator ascending to the top floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive residential towers. The tension between them had shifted, no longer just the magnetic pull of attraction, but the shared adrenaline of conspirators facing a common enemy. Patrick's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. But tonight, neither of them had eyes for the spectacular cityscape. Patrick moved immediately to his home office, a minimalist space dominated by a sleek desk and state-of-the-art computer system. This is an isolated server, he explained as he connected the flash drive. Whatever's on this drive can't infect my main networks or send out tracking information. Zita stood beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint jasmine scent of her perfume, feel the warmth radiating from her body. Despite the circumstances, despite the threat hanging over them, Patrick found himself acutely aware of her presence, not just as an ally in this fight, but as a woman who had somehow breached the walls he'd built around his heart. The flash drive contained a single video file. Patrick hesitated, his finger hovering over the keyboard. "Whatever's on this," he said quietly, "it could change everything I thought I knew about Clara's death." Zita's hand found his shoulder, a gentle touch that somehow conveyed both strength and understanding. "You don't have to face it alone this time." With a deep breath, Patrick clicked play. The video was grainy, obviously taken from a security camera at some distance. It showed a rain-soaked stretch of the FDR drive, date-stamped the night of Clara's accident. Patrick's breath caught as a familiar BMW came into view, moving at what appeared to be a normal speed despite the poor conditions. Then, from behind, another vehicle appeared, a black SUV with tinted windows. It accelerated suddenly, moving up close behind Clara's car, headlights on high beam. "What the hell?" Patrick whispered, leaning closer. The SUV swerved, clipping the BMW's rear bumper. Clara's car fishtailed, spinning out of control until it hit the guardrail and flipped over it, disappearing from the camera's view. The SUV slowed momentarily, then accelerated away from the scene. The video ended, and Patrick sat frozen, his world collapsing around him for the second time that night. "That wasn't an accident," Zita said, her voice tight with horror. "Someone ran her off the road deliberately." Patrick couldn't speak, couldn't think beyond the terrible truth unfolding before him. For 5 years, he'd carried the guilt of Clara's death, believing his harsh words, his dismissal of her foundation, his interference in her relationship had driven her to tears and led to the fatal accident. But this was something far worse. This was murder. "Why?" he finally managed. "Who would want to hurt Clara?" Zita was staring at the frozen final frame of the video, her expression grim. "The question isn't just who would want to hurt Clara," she said slowly. "It's who would benefit from you believing you were responsible for her death." The implication hit Patrick like a thunderbolt. "Richard," he whispered. "Richard has this video." Richard knew about the second car, about details that were kept out of the official reports. "We need more information before we jump to conclusions," Zita cautioned. "But yes, the timing of his blackmail, his knowledge of the accident, it's suspicious." Patrick stood abruptly, anger coursing through him like wildfire. "I'll destroy him," he growled. "If he had anything to do with Clara's death." "Patrick!" Zita's voice cut through his rage, firm but gentle. "We need to be smart about this. If Richard is involved, confronting him directly could be dangerous. And if he isn't, we need to find out who is." Her reasonable tone penetrated his fury, and Patrick took a deep breath, forcing himself to think strategically rather than emotionally. "You're right," he conceded. "We need more information. My security team should have preliminary data on Richard by morning. And I can ask around the neighborhood tomorrow," Zita added. "See if there are any connections between Richard and the Meridian project that might not show up in official paperwork." Patrick nodded, his mind already mapping out next steps, contingency plans, resources he could deploy. This was familiar territory: problem-solving, strategy, the calculation of risk and reward. But underneath it all ran a current of emotion so powerful it threatened to sweep away his hard-won control. Clara wasn't just my sister, he said quietly. She was the best of us, the Blake with a conscience, with a heart. Our parents were cold, calculating business people who saw emotions as weakness. Clara was different. She felt everything, cared about everyone. When our parents died, she was the one who insisted we use our inheritance to help others, not just grow the business. Zita moved to stand beside him, her presence a steadying force. Tell me about her foundation, the one she wanted to build in the neighborhood. Patrick smiled faintly, memories washing over him. She called it Canvas Dreams. The idea was to create a space where kids from underprivileged backgrounds could explore art in all its forms: painting, music, theater, dance. She believed that creativity could heal trauma, could give kids a voice when the world had silenced them. That sounds beautiful, Zita said softly. And exactly like what I try to do with my students every day. She would have loved you, Patrick said, the words escaping before he could consider them. You have her passion, her belief in the power of art to transform lives. Have you ever discovered that what you thought was true wasn't the full story? Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes the truth is more complex than we first believed. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. A recognition of shared values, of complementary strengths, of the possibility that they had found in each other not just allies in this fight, but kindred spirits in a deeper sense. Zita broke the gaze first, glancing at her watch. It's late, she said. We should both get some rest if we're going to figure this out tomorrow. Stay, Patrick said impulsively. I have 4 guest rooms. It's safer than going back to your apartment when we don't know how much Richard knows about our conversation. Zita hesitated, clearly weighing the logic of his suggestion against conventional caution. I don't have anything with me. No clothes, no toiletries. I can have whatever you need delivered by morning, Patrick replied. Perks of being a billionaire. Things happen quickly when you ask for them. A small smile played at the corners of Zita's mouth. Is that your secret superpower? Making things happen quickly. One of them, Patrick said, returning her smile despite the gravity of their situation. Along with an uncanny ability to identify undervalued assets and an encyclopedic knowledge of global shipping routes. Fascinating dinner party conversation, I'm sure, Zita teased. The moment of lightness was a relief amid the darkness that had enveloped them since Richard's revelation. Patrick realized with some surprise that it had been years since he'd bantered with anyone, years since he'd allowed himself the simple pleasure of humor and connection. So you'll stay? He asked. Zita nodded slowly. On one condition. Name it. Tomorrow, after we visit the neighborhood, we find Clara's foundation plans. We figure out exactly what she wanted to build and where. Because if we're going to fight Richard, we need to know what we're fighting for, not just what we're fighting against. The request caught Patrick off guard. He'd locked away Clara's plans along with every other reminder of her, physical evidence of dreams that would never come true, of a future stolen too soon. Opening that vault of memories would mean facing grief he'd suppressed for 5 years. But looking at Zita's determined expression, Patrick realized that honoring Clara's vision was the only way to truly fight for her legacy. Not through guilt and isolation, but through action and purpose. Her files are in storage, he said. I kept everything, all her sketches, her business plans, her vision boards. I couldn't bear to look at them, but I couldn't throw them away either. Then that's where we start, Zita said decisively. We build from Clara's vision. Something warm and unexpected bloomed in Patrick's chest, not just attraction or gratitude, but hope. For the first time in 5 years, he could imagine a future that wasn't defined by guilt and loss, but by purpose and possibility. I'll show you to your room, he said. And then I need to make some calls, set things in motion for tomorrow. As they walked through the penthouse, Patrick was suddenly aware of how cold and impersonal the space was. More like a luxury hotel suite than a home. The art on the walls was valuable but selected by a decorator, the furniture elegant but untouched by real life. There were no personal photos, no mementos, nothing that revealed the man who lived there. Zita seemed to notice it too, her eyes taking in the sterile perfection with something like sadness. You've been living like a ghost, she said quietly. I haven't been living at all, Patrick admitted. Just existing. They reached the guest suite, and Patrick opened the door to reveal a spacious room with its own sitting area and bathroom. Like the rest of the penthouse, it was beautifully appointed but devoid of personality. The closet should have robes and basic necessities, he explained. I'll have clothes and anything else you need delivered first thing in the morning. Just text me a list. Zita nodded, stepping into the room and turning to face him. In the soft light, with her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders and her navy dress slightly wrinkled from a long evening, she looked both vulnerable and strong, a contradiction that drew Patrick like a magnet. Thank you, she said. Not just for the room, but for trusting me with this. For being willing to face the truth about Clara's death, however painful it might be. I should be thanking you, Patrick replied. 6 hours ago, I was sitting alone at that wedding, drowning in guilt and isolation. Now. He trailed off, unsure how to express the seismic shift in his world. Now we have a purpose, Zita finished for him. A fight worth fighting. Yes, Patrick agreed. Exactly that. They stood in the doorway, neither moving to close the distance between them nor to step away. The air seemed charged with possibility. Not just the adrenaline of their investigation, but the deeper current of connection that had been building since that first moment on the dance floor. Finally, Zita broke the spell, taking a small step back. Good night, Patrick, she said softly. Try to get some rest. Good night, Zita, he replied. And, thank you for pretending to be with me tonight. A smile touched her lips, gentle and genuine. Who says I was pretending? With that, she closed the door, leaving Patrick standing in the hallway with his heart racing and his mind spinning with possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to imagine for 5 long years. As he walked back to his office to make the necessary calls, Patrick felt more alive than he had since Clara's death. The guilt and grief were still there, they might always be, but now they were accompanied by something else: determination. Determination to uncover the truth about Clara's death, to protect the community she'd cared about, to honor her legacy in a way that would make her proud. And perhaps, just perhaps, to open his heart to the unexpected connection he'd found with a woman brave enough to see past his walls to the man he could become. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Patrick's penthouse, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. Patrick hadn't slept, his mind too full of revelations and possibilities to find rest. Instead, he'd spent the night reviewing every document related to Clara's accident, every business connection to Richard Hawthorne, every detail that might shed light on the truth he'd been blind to for 5 years. When Zita emerged from the guest suite, dressed in the clothes Patrick had arranged to be delivered at dawn, she found him in the kitchen, standing over the holographic display that had transformed the marble island into a digital web of connections and possibilities. You look like you've been up all night, she said, accepting the coffee he offered her. I have been, Patrick admitted. My security team sent over everything they could find on Richard. Financial records, business dealings, personal history. I've been mapping connections, looking for anything that might explain his vendetta. Zita studied the complex web of information hovering above the counter. And there's something not right about his relationship with the Meridian Project. Patrick gestured toward a cluster of documents. On paper, Richard's firm is just handling the legal work for BTL Development, the company behind Meridian. But his financial stake is disproportionate to his official role. He stands to make nearly 30% of the projected profits. That's unusual for just legal representation, Zita agreed, leaning closer to examine the figures. More than unusual, it's suspicious. Especially when you consider this. Patrick swiped his hand through the display, bringing forward another document. Richard's firm took over representation of BTL 5 years ago. Right after Clara died, Zita said, the implication clear in her voice. Patrick nodded grimly. And BTL acquired the Meridian property 4 years and 10 months ago, barely 2 months after Clara's accident. The same property where Clara wanted to build her art center? The exact same area. Patrick pulled up a map, highlighting a section of Brooklyn that glowed red in the holographic display. Canvas Dreams was meant to be the centerpiece of a community revitalization project. Clara had already secured commitments from local businesses, arts organizations, and educational institutions. Zita's expression darkened. So Richard has a financial motive tied directly to the property Clara was interested in, and his involvement began immediately after her death. It gets worse, Patrick said, pulling up another document. BTL Development is owned through a series of shell companies. My team traced the ownership structure back to an offshore entity called Hawkeye Investments. Hawthorne, Zita whispered, making the connection. Not directly traceable to him, but the timing and the name are too coincidental to ignore. Patrick ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his gesture. I still don't understand why. Why target Clara? Why spend 5 years planning this elaborate scheme? Zita was quiet for a moment, her storm-colored eyes thoughtful as she studied the information before her. We're missing something. Some connection between Richard and Clara that would explain the personal nature of this vendetta. Patrick's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from frustration to surprise. My team found something, he said. Security footage from my office building the day Clara died. They've enhanced and analyzed it based on the new information about the second car. He tapped the screen, and a new video appeared in the holographic display. Unlike the grainy footage from the flash drive, this was clear, high-definition video from the lobby of Blake Industries headquarters. The timestamp showed it was from the afternoon of Clara's death. Clara appeared on screen, her face tearful but determined as she exited the elevator and crossed the lobby. She was speaking intently on her phone, gesturing with her free hand in the animated way Patrick remembered so well. Can we get audio? Zita asked. Patrick shook his head. Lobby cameras record video only, for privacy reasons. But my team has an expert lip reader analyzing the footage. They watched as Clara pushed through the revolving doors into the rain, still on her phone. The camera angle shifted to the exterior view, showing Clara hurrying to her car, sheltering her phone from the downpour. Wait, Patrick said suddenly. Zoom in on the street. The image expanded, focusing on the row of vehicles parked across from the building entrance. Among them was a black SUV with tinted windows, the same type of vehicle that had run Clara off the road in the footage from the flash drive. That's it, Patrick breathed. That's the car that killed her. As they watched, Clara got into her BMW and pulled away from the curb. Moments later, the black SUV followed, staying at a discreet distance but clearly tracking her movements. Someone was waiting for her, Zita said, her voice tight with horror. Someone knew she would be at your office that day. Patrick felt sick, his mind racing with implications. The only people who knew Clara was coming to see me were my assistant and... He trailed off, a terrible suspicion forming. And who? Zita prompted. Michael Chen, Patrick said quietly. I called him right before Clara arrived, told him I knew what he was doing, that he'd never work in the industry again. He must have called Clara immediately afterward. You think Michael was involved in her death? Zita asked, her expression skeptical. I don't know, Patrick admitted. But it's a connection we need to explore. His phone buzzed again with another message from his security team. This one contained a transcript of Clara's lip movements from the lobby footage, the expert's best interpretation of what she had been saying on the phone. Patrick read it aloud, his voice growing increasingly strained. I know what you did. How could you use me like this? No, it's too late for excuses. I'm going to tell him everything. He deserves to know the truth about you, about all of this. I trusted you. She wasn't talking to you, Zita realized. She was confronting someone else before she came to see you. Michael, Patrick said with growing certainty. She must have discovered that he was using her to get information about Blake Industries. That's why she was coming to my office, not to confront me about having him fired, but to warn me that he'd betrayed us both. Zita was frowning, something in the surveillance footage catching her attention. Patrick, look at the timestamp on this video. Patrick glanced at the numbers in the corner of the image. 4:47 p.m. What about it? When did you say your last call with Clara happened? The one where you dismissed her foundation as a distraction. Patrick closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember the painful details. Around 6:30 p.m. She called my direct line, we argued briefly, and I told her I didn't have time for distractions. But this footage shows her leaving your building at 4:47 p.m., nearly 2 hours earlier. Zita's voice was gaining intensity. If she was already leaving your office at 4:47, how could she have called you at 6:30 from there? Patrick stared at her, the implications sending a chill down his spine. She couldn't have. But I spoke to her. I heard her voice. Or someone who sounded like her, Zita suggested. Modern voice synthesis technology can be remarkably accurate with enough sample audio. You think someone impersonated Clara to ensure I wouldn't look for her? To create the narrative that she left my office upset because of our argument. I think someone went to extraordinary lengths to make you believe you were responsible for Clara's death, Zita said quietly. Someone who benefited from your guilt and isolation. Someone who knew that if you believed you'd caused Clara's accident, you wouldn't look deeper into what really happened. Patrick's mind raced, reassessing 5 years of grief and guilt in light of this new information. If Clara hadn't called him at 6:30, if she hadn't driven away from his office in tears because of his dismissive words, then everything he believed about his role in her death was based on a lie. Richard, he said, his voice hardening. It has to be Richard. But why? What's his connection to Clara? To Michael? To any of this? Zita was studying the complex web of information hovering in the holographic display, her expression thoughtful. We need to find Michael Chen, she said. If Clara was confronting him about betraying her, he might be the key to understanding what really happened that day. Patrick nodded, already reaching for his phone to instruct his security team to locate Michael Chen. But before he could make the call, his screen lit up with an incoming video call from an unlisted number. With a sense of foreboding, Patrick accepted the call. Richard Hawthorne's face appeared on the screen, his expression smug. Good morning, Patrick, Richard said smoothly. I see you've been busy. Your security team has been making quite a lot of inquiries about me. Not very subtle. Patrick's jaw tightened. What do you want, Richard? I want to make sure we're still on the same page regarding the Meridian project. The Planning Commission meets in 36 hours, and I need your full support. Why? Patrick demanded. What's your real stake in this? Why does this particular development matter so much to you? Richard's smile never reached his eyes. Let's just say I made a promise to ensure that property would never become what your sister envisioned. A promise I intend to keep, with or without your cooperation. A promise to whom? Patrick pressed. That's not your concern, Richard replied. Your concern should be what happens when I release the full story of your role in Clara's death. Not just to the media, but to her friends, her colleagues, everyone who loved her. How do you think they'll feel knowing you destroyed her boyfriend's career out of jealousy, drove her to tears, and sent her into the path of a fatal accident? We know that's not what happened, Patrick said coldly. We have evidence that Clara was targeted, that her accident was deliberate. For the first time, Richard's composure slipped. A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he recovered his confident smile. Evidence? He scoffed. What evidence could you possibly have? Security footage from my building showing Clara leaving hours before she supposedly called me. Footage of a black SUV following her from the lobby. The same SUV that ran her off the road. Richard's expression hardened. You're bluffing. Am I? Patrick countered. You gave me the first piece of the puzzle yourself, Richard. The flash drive with the traffic camera footage. Did you think I wouldn't investigate further? That I wouldn't use every resource at my disposal to find the truth once I knew to look for it? A tense silence stretched between them, Richard's calculated confidence visibly wavering. 36 hours, Patrick, he finally said. Support the Meridian project, or face the consequences. I don't care what evidence you think you have. The court of public opinion doesn't require proof beyond reasonable doubt. The call ended abruptly, leaving Patrick and Zita staring at the blank screen. He's rattled, Zita observed. You caught him off guard with the mention of the security footage. But he's still confident enough to maintain his ultimatum, Patrick noted. which means either he doesn't believe we have enough evidence to connect him directly to Clara's death, or he has an ace we haven't seen yet, Zita finished. Something that makes him feel untouchable. Patrick turned back to the holographic display, studying the complex web of connections. There's still something we're missing. Some piece of the puzzle that would explain why Richard has this personal vendetta against Clara's legacy. Zita was quiet for a moment, her gaze focused on a particular document in the display, Richard's personal history. "Patrick," she said slowly, "did you ever meet Richard before Clara's death?" Patrick frowned, thinking back. "No. Our paths never crossed professionally or socially." "Why?" "Because according to this, Richard Hawthorne only moved to New York 6 years ago. Before that, he was based in Chicago, working for a different law firm." So why would someone with no previous connection to you or Clara develop such an elaborate scheme to destroy her legacy and manipulate you? It doesn't make sense unless... Zita trailed off, her expression suddenly alert. "Patrick, did Clara ever live in Chicago?" "For a year, right after college," Patrick confirmed. "She had an internship at the Art Institute before she moved back to New York." "Why?" Zita tapped rapidly on the holographic display, pulling up more information about Richard's time in Chicago. Richard was married while he lived in Chicago. His wife's name was Eleanor Hawthorne. She filed for divorce 7 years ago, citing irreconcilable differences. "I don't see the connection," Patrick said, frustration edging his voice. "Wait," Zita murmured, still scanning the documents. Eleanor Hawthorne was the director of education outreach at the Art Institute during the same period Clara interned there. Patrick's pulse quickened as pieces began to fall into place. Clara would have worked directly with her. "And according to these court records," Zita continued, her voice growing more urgent, "the divorce proceedings were particularly bitter. Eleanor accused Richard of emotional abuse and financial control. She was granted a restraining order against him during the proceedings." "What happened to her?" Patrick asked, dread building in his chest. Zita's expression grew somber as she pulled up a news article from 6 years ago. "She died, Patrick, in a car accident. 6 months after the divorce was finalized and 2 weeks after she announced plans to move to New York to establish an arts education foundation." The parallels were too striking to ignore. Patrick stared at the article, at the photo of a smiling woman with kind eyes and a determined expression that reminded him painfully of Clara. "Clara never mentioned knowing Eleanor," Patrick said, trying to process this new information. "She never said anything about a connection to someone from the Art Institute." "Maybe she didn't know the connection," Zita suggested. "Or maybe she was protecting someone." Patrick's phone chimed with a new message from his security team. He opened it, his expression darkening as he read the contents. "My team located Michael Chen," he said grimly. "He's been living under an assumed name in Seattle for the past 5 years. And he's agreed to speak with us. Says he has information about Clara's death that he's been too afraid to share until now." "Afraid of whom?" Zita asked. "He wouldn't say over the phone. He's being flown here now, should arrive within 3 hours." Zita nodded, determination settling over her features. "Then we have 3 hours to get Clara's foundation plans and visit the neighborhood, to understand exactly what's at stake in this fight." Patrick agreed, and within 20 minutes, they were in his private car, heading first to the storage facility where he'd kept Clara's belongings, then to the Brooklyn neighborhood that had been at the center of his sister's final dream, and was now the focus of Richard's destructive obsession. The storage unit was climate-controlled, meticulously organized, and had remained untouched since Patrick had ordered Clara's possessions placed there 5 years ago. He stood now at the entrance, key in hand, hesitating as the weight of memories threatened to overwhelm him. "You don't have to do this alone," Zita said quietly, her hand finding his in a gesture that had already become familiar, a connection that grounded him when grief threatened to pull him under. Together, they unlocked the unit and stepped inside. Clara's life was preserved here like a museum exhibit. Furniture draped in protective covers, boxes labeled in Patrick's precise handwriting, framed photographs wrapped carefully in acid-free paper. Patrick moved directly to a large flat file cabinet in the corner. Her foundation plans would be in here, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Clara was meticulous about her work. Everything would have been documented, organized. He opened the top drawer, revealing neatly labeled folders. But as he began to search through them, a frown creased his brow. Something's wrong, he said. These aren't in the right order. Someone's been through these files. Zita moved to his side, examining the folders. How can you tell? Clara had a specific organizational system. Color-coded tabs, chronological ordering. These have been rearranged, and... Patrick paused, pulling out a folder labeled Canvas Dreams, Final Proposal. This isn't her handwriting. He opened the folder, spreading its contents across the top of the cabinet. The documents inside looked legitimate at first glance. Architectural renderings, budget projections, mission statements. But as Patrick examined them more closely, his frown deepened. These aren't Clara's plans, he said with growing certainty. The design elements are all wrong. Clara was passionate about open spaces, natural light, multipurpose areas that could transform based on community needs. These plans show a much more traditional, compartmentalized approach. Could she have revised her vision? Zita suggested. Patrick shook his head. Not like this. And the budget projections are inflated by at least 30% from what she told me. It's as if someone created a version of her foundation that would be financially unfeasible, architecturally uninspiring, and fundamentally disconnected from her vision. Someone wanted her foundation to fail, Zita said quietly, or at least to appear unviable to anyone who reviewed these plans after her death. Patrick continued searching through the drawers, growing increasingly agitated as he discovered more discrepancies, more evidence that Clara's careful work had been tampered with. Her original plans have to be here somewhere, he insisted. Clara would have kept backup copies, digital versions, something. As if on cue, his phone buzzed with another message from his security team. He read it quickly, his expression brightening. They found a cloud storage account registered to Clara, he reported. It's been inactive since her death, but all the files are still there. They're sending access credentials now. While they waited for the credentials, Patrick and Zita continued exploring the storage unit. Zita moved toward a collection of framed photographs, carefully unwrapping one to reveal Clara's smiling face. She was beautiful, Zita said softly. She has your eyes. She had our mother's eyes, Patrick corrected, and our father's determination. But the kindness, the optimism, that was all Clara. Zita unwrapped another photograph, this one showing Clara with a group of people in what appeared to be an art studio. Is this from her time in Chicago? Patrick moved closer, examining the image. Yes, that's the Art Institute. Clara's internship year. Zita pointed to a woman standing beside Clara, both of them laughing at something off-camera. Is that Eleanor Hawthorne? Patrick stared at the woman's face, recognition dawning. It could be. I never met her, but the timing and location would fit. They look close, Zita observed. Not just professional colleagues. Before Patrick could respond, his phone chimed with the arrival of Clara's cloud storage credentials. He logged in immediately, navigating through folders until he found what they were searching for. Canvas Dreams, in Clara's original vision. This is it, he said, relief evident in his voice. Her actual plans, untampered with. They spent the next hour reviewing Clara's vision for Canvas Dreams. It was everything Patrick had remembered and more. A beautiful, functional space designed to serve the community's needs while inspiring creativity and connection. The architectural renderings showed a building that seemed to emerge organically from its surroundings, with walls that could reconfigure, rooftop gardens, studio spaces flooded with natural light, and common areas designed to foster collaboration and community. It's beautiful, Zita said, genuine awe in her voice. This isn't just an art center, it's a vision for what a community could be. Clara never did anything halfway, Patrick said, pride mingling with grief in his voice. When she believed in something, she put her whole heart into it. As they continued exploring Clara's digital archives, Patrick opened a folder labeled Personal, Chicago. Inside were hundreds of photographs from Clara's year at the Art Institute, many featuring Eleanor Hawthorne. They were definitely close, Zita said, scrolling through images of the two women at museums, restaurants, parks, clearly spending time together beyond professional obligations. Then Patrick opened a subfolder labeled simply E, and everything changed.